A sudden red flare. An empty sea. No ships expected. The lighthouse stood dark, forgotten. Beside the keeper, his loyal dog growled softly. Something was out there. Someone needed help. The storm was rising. Time was running out. And soon, they would face what waited in the darkness. The flare tore across the sky like a red scar, bright and unnatural against the endless dark. Walter Griggs narrowed his eyes as the light vanished into the clouds, leaving behind only silence and sea. The wind pressed cold against his face, salt sharp in his throat, but he didn't move. No vessels were scheduled this week. Nothing but open water stretching 50 miles in every direction, and yet he had seen it. One bright arc of red, and now nothing. Inside the old keeper's quarters, Brutus barked once. Just once. That was all it took to unsettle Walter more than the flare had. The old German shepherd didn't bark at the wind. At 10 years old, he had grown too wise for that. If Brutus made a sound, it meant something. Walter stepped back inside and found the dog already pacing near the gear room, ears twitching, eyes alert. He stood beside the emergency flare kit like he knew the protocol, like he remembered how many nights they'd run this drill in the past, before technology took over, before Walter became unnecessary. He hadn't meant to light the beacon tonight. It hadn't shone in months. Not since the Coast Guard automated the channel routes, shut down half the outposts, and told men like him that the future didn't need watchmen, just wires and weather satellites. But there had been something in that flare. Something about the silence that followed. Something about the way Brutus stood waiting without a sound. Walter pulled on his old coat, the canvas stiff with salt and age, and stepped into the storm. The lighthouse rose ahead, tall and unmoving, its windows black. He climbed the narrow stairwell without speaking, knees aching with every step, the lantern chamber groaning above like it hadn't been touched in years. The controls still worked. The switch responded to his hand as if it had been waiting for him all along. The great Fresnel lens came to life, humming low, casting long, slow beams out into the night. The light swept over endless water, and Walter lifted his binoculars, heart thudding, breath thudding from the climb. At first, nothing, just wave after wave breaking under moonless sky. But then he saw it again, a shadow on the water, low and barely floating, drifting without direction, and a figure, small, almost lost in the darkness, raising something in the air, waving. No second flare came, no radio call. Just that one movement, a signal against the void. Walter lowered the binoculars. Brutus stood at the top of the stairs, motionless, his eyes reflecting the sweep of the lens like two watchful stars. Walter didn't speak, didn't ask, didn't need to. The dog turned toward the door. Walter followed. The shed door groaned as Walter shoved it open, Brutus pressing close beside him, head low, tail still. The old aluminum skiff sat beneath a dusty tarp, untouched since summer. Walter hadn't planned to take it out again, not in this kind of weather, not with the lighthouse decommissioned and the station due to shut down within days. But there were no plans left to follow now, just instinct, old training, and a gut feeling that someone out there had called for help and had no one else to answer. The tarp peeled back stiffly under Walter's hands. The boat was weathered but intact, salt-stained and familiar, like an old friend he hadn't spoken to in years. The fuel can sat where he'd left it, still half full. He poured it in, muttering under his breath, something more habit than prayer, and Brutus watched without blinking, muscles tight beneath his coat. They pushed the boat to the launch ramp. Rain sliced across the deck in long diagonal streaks. The wind howled louder now, and Walter felt it in his bones. The kind of storm that didn't just knock down trees, but tore up everything quiet inside a man and forced it to the surface. The boat hit the water hard, slapped by the first wave before it had fully floated. Brutus jumped in with practiced ease, landing near the bow, paws steady despite the slick deck. Walter followed and started the engine. It coughed once, then caught, rumbling low as they nosed out into the channel. The beam of the lighthouse swept past every 10 seconds, the rhythm as familiar as his own heartbeat. Walter steered into the open sea, his eyes narrowing through the rain. The waves came fast, heavy with winter chill, crashing against the hull, sending spray over the sides. The skiff rocked violently, but Brutus stood firm, eyes forward, locked on the horizon, as if he knew where they were going even if Walter didn't. The wind tore at Walter's collar. His fingers ached against the tiller. Still, he kept the bow pointed toward the place he had last seen the shape on the water, letting the sweep of the light guide him like a ghost of duty that refused to die. Then he saw it again, closer now. A small fishing boat, wooden, half sunk on one side, dead in the water. A single figure on deck, waving something, maybe a coat, maybe a shirt. Arms weak but desperate. Walter brought the skiff alongside, cut the motor, and let the current do the rest. As they bumped gently against the hull, Brutus barked once, sharp and deep, and a second figure rose beside the first. A woman, drenched, eyes wide with panic, holding a child against her chest. Walter shouted over the wind, asked if anyone was hurt, and the woman pointed toward the cabin, her voice hoarse and breaking as she said, "My husband. He collapsed. Please, help." Walter didn't hesitate. He tied the skiff to the boat with one practiced knot and climbed aboard. The deck groaned under his weight. Rain pelted him sideways. The cabin door hung open, swinging slightly, and he ducked inside, heart pounding. The man lay crumpled near the engine panel, face pale, breathing shallow. Walter knelt beside him, checked his pulse. Weak, but still there. He hoisted the man over his shoulder with a grunt, his back protesting with every step as he carried him out onto the deck, lowering him into the skiff with Brutus's help. The dog shifting his weight carefully, steadying the boy with his body. The woman climbed down next, slipping once on the rail, catching herself on Walter's arm. Her hands were ice. She murmured thanks. He could barely hear over the storm. As he prepared to follow, a wave slammed the side of the fishing boat, hard. The line snapped. The skiff jerked away. Brutus barked again, standing between the child and the edge. Walter cursed, grabbed the rope, and leapt. He landed half on the edge of the skiff, half in the water. Brutus grabbed his coat with his teeth and pulled. They were in. The boy screamed as another wave hit, soaking them. Walter lunged for the engine. It sputtered, then caught again. He turned the bow toward shore. Lightning flashed behind them. Thunder cracked so close it shook his ribs. The boat pitched and rolled. Walter kept one hand on the throttle, one on the side rail. Brutus huddled near the child, protecting him from the wind. The lighthouse beam appeared through the fog, sweeping wide, bright and steady. Walter pushed forward, muscles burning, eyes fixed on that light. He could feel the weight of every year pressing into his shoulders, but he didn't stop. Not now. Not with lives depending on him. Not with Brutus beside him, soaked and silent, his breath steaming into the night. Not with the promise of light still shining ahead. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving behind a world soaked in silence and salt. Walter sat at the table in the keeper's kitchen, his soaked coat hung over the back of the chair, steam rising from the kettle on the stove. The woman and her husband were wrapped in blankets by the hearth, still shivering but alive. The boy slept on the couch, curled tight beside Brutus, his small hand resting on the dog's shoulder like it belonged there. Brutus didn't move, only opened his eyes when Walter looked over, the faint glow of the dying fire reflected in his gaze. Walter cradled his mug between both hands. He didn't drink it, just let the warmth seep into his fingers. His body ached in places he'd forgotten could ache, and every breath felt like it had to be earned. But he was awake. He was still here. That counted for something. He let his eyes wander over the cabin. The same wooden walls Clara had painted pale green the summer they moved in. The shelf above the sink still held the row of blue ceramic mugs she loved, and her old boots still sat near the back door, untouched. 6 years, and he still hadn't moved them. Not because he couldn't, but because it didn't feel right. The light had stayed on for her, even after she was gone, and somehow it felt like the house had too. He glanced out the window. The sea had calmed, but the sky was heavy, still holding something in its belly. He knew it wouldn't be the last storm, but this one, this night, felt like something had shifted. Maybe not outside, maybe just in him. The boy stirred. Brutus adjusted his weight, but didn't get up. Walter watched the child's hand slide deeper into the dog's fur, fingers curling in sleep. There was a peace to it, a softness he hadn't expected to feel again, and in that quiet moment, something inside Walter softened too. He hadn't realized how far he drifted from people, how much easier it had been to talk to the wind and the dog and the empty sea than to look someone in the eye. But tonight had cracked something open. He looked back at the lighthouse. Its beam still swept the ocean like it had always done, even when no one asked it to, even when no one saw it. Clara had said once, half asleep in their bed, that the light wasn't for the ships, it was for the people waiting on shore. A promise. Walter had never forgotten that. He stood slowly, knees stiff, heart tired, and crossed the room. Brutus lifted his head. Walter knelt beside him, resting a hand gently on his side. "We kept it on," he whispered, "just like I said we would." The boy followed Walter down to the docks just after sunrise, his small boots leaving narrow prints in the damp earth. Brutus walked between them, glancing up at the child from time to time, tail swaying in slow, even rhythm. The sea had calmed, its gray surface gently lapping against the worn planks, no longer furious, just restless. Walter moved carefully, each step measured. His muscles still ached from the night before, but there was something easier in his breath, something steadier. They didn't talk. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind of quiet that came after storms, when the worst had passed and the world was still catching its breath. The boy paused near the edge of the dock and stared out over the water. He looked smaller in the daylight than he had in the storm. Fragile, but Walter had seen the way he held tight to Brutus, the way he hadn't cried when the waves came, the way he reached out without hesitation to help his father from the floor of the boat. There was strength there, too, quiet, but firm. Walter knelt beside the skiff. He drained most of the water from it, patched a torn strap, refastened the oars. It would hold. The woman and her husband were inside, resting. They'd told him their boat was old, borrowed, half broken before they left the harbor. They'd been looking for something. Work, maybe. A place to start again. They hadn't found it, but they had survived. Sometimes that was the start. The boy pointed toward the horizon. "That's where we came from," he said, his voice soft as if unused. Walter nodded without speaking. He didn't need to ask what they'd left behind. Most people didn't set out into a winter sea without reason. And sometimes leaving was the bravest thing a person could do. Brutus stepped to the edge of the dock, sat, and stared at the light tower behind them. The beam was off now, no longer needed in daylight, but the lens still glinted in the sun, watching. Walter followed his gaze. The lighthouse had stood for over 100 years. It had seen wars, storms, shipwrecks, and weddings. And now it had seen something else. A man pulled back into the world he'd slowly drifted from. He looked at the boy again, then at the skiff, then down at his hands. They were old hands, scarred, stiff, worn by salt and time, but they still worked, still held weight, still offered something. "You want to help me launch it?" he asked. The boy nodded. Together, they pushed the skiff gently into the water. It rocked, settled, then floated. Ready again. Not to escape, but to return. The warning came too late. Walter had felt it in his knees before the barometer dropped, before the wind turned sharp and wet, before the horizon disappeared behind a wall of fast-moving cloud. He stood on the tower balcony, binoculars shaking in his hands, the radio hissing static behind him, Brutus pacing below like he could already smell the danger in the air. The family's boat was out again, borrowed one last time to try and reach the mainland before the next squall, and Walter had let them go, believing the skies would hold just long enough. But now he saw it cresting over the edge of the sea, like a beast unfolding from the deep, layered clouds like bruised muscle. The wind snapping back toward land, pulling the scent of lightning in its teeth. He ran. Down the spiral steps, his breath ragged, boots pounding metal, Brutus close behind, both of them bursting out into a wind that almost shoved him backward. He didn't stop. He reached the dock, grabbed the emergency beacon case, threw it into the skiff, kicked the motor into gear without a word. The storm was faster than anything he'd seen in years. Not a slow roll of thunder, but a sprint of wind and fury and water, and somewhere out there, a small boat was about to be swallowed whole. So, he didn't think, didn't plan, just held the throttle and pointed the bow toward the dark. The first wave hit like a slap, cold and mean, soaking them both, but Brutus didn't move from his place at the front, just braced himself and growled low in his throat, as if daring the storm to come closer. Visibility dropped to nothing. The rain came sideways, the sea lifted in sheets, and still he pushed on, hands white-knuckled on the controls, ears ringing with the roar of water. He scanned left, right, called out names that were stolen by wind before they reached even his own ears. Then, a shape, barely visible, a flash of white hull, a scrap of tarp torn loose and flapping like a broken wing. He turned hard, nearly tipping them, skiff slamming against the bigger boat, lines thrown and missed, then thrown again and caught. Brutus leapt without hesitation, claws scraping the wet deck, and Walter followed, knees nearly giving. The boy was there, huddled near the cabin, soaked and crying, the mother holding tight to a rail, and the father on the floor again, unconscious or worse. Walter moved like instinct, like years melted away, dragged one body, then two, into the skiff, heart hammering, vision blurring with rain and fear. Brutus barked, sharp and loud, not in panic but command, and Walter understood. Now. They jumped. The boat ripped free. He didn't look back. The boat slammed against the rocks, harder than he expected, metal shrieking beneath them as the skiff lurched sideways and scraped against the shoreline like a wounded animal. Walter threw himself over the side, boots slipping on seaweed as slick stone, arms grabbing for the boy as Brutus pushed the woman forward with urgent nudges of his head. The man still unconscious, dead weight in the hull. Water now ankle-deep inside the boat. But they were close, just feet from the stairs that led up to the lighthouse bluff. Lightning cracked overhead, painting the cliffs white for an instant, and in that flash Walter saw it. A figure, standing near the tree line, tall, unmoving, too far to see a face but clear as day, watching, not helping, not moving, just there. He blinked, and it was gone. He didn't speak. There wasn't time to question anything, just move. Brutus herded the boy up the stairs as Walter lifted the man over his shoulder, legs trembling, chest burning, each step a war. The rain came sideways again, bitter and cruel, and the path to the keeper's house blurred under his feet, but he knew it like breath, every turn, every stone. The door burst open with his shoulder. The lights flickered once and held, and he laid the man on the rug beside the stove, already barking orders at the woman to grab towels, water, anything warm. Brutus stayed near the boy, tail stiff, eyes still fixed on the door like he expected it to open again. Walter turned back once the others were settled and stepped out onto the porch alone, the storm easing now into a wet gray hush, clouds curling low over the sea like steam from a dying fire. He scanned the trees. Nothing. Just wind. No footprints. No shadow. No sound. But he knew what he saw. Or he thought he did. Back inside, the boy had curled into the same spot Brutus had once claimed, blankets piled around him, cheeks flushed from cold but safe. The man coughed, shallow and weak, but alive. The woman met Walter's eyes across the room, something quiet passing between them. Not gratitude, not yet, but something older. Recognition, maybe. Walter sat heavily in the old rocking chair, soaked to the bone, hands trembling slightly now that it was over, or close to it, and Brutus came to sit beside him, pressing close, gaze still pointed toward the window. Then the boy spoke. Just 3 words. Soft, almost a whisper. He was waiting. Walter leaned forward, heart slowing, voice barely audible. Who? The boy didn't answer, just looked toward the trees, and Brutus didn't stop watching. The storm had passed, but the house did not feel still. It breathed. The wind tapped softly against the windows, like fingers too cold to knock. The stove crackled low, and in the quiet, every sound felt louder than it should. The groan of old wood, the creak of the rocking chair as Walter leaned forward, elbows on knees. Brutus, unmoving at his side, ears alert but not tense, eyes locked on something Walter could not see. The boy had fallen asleep again finally, but even in sleep his small hand remained curled around the edge of the blanket, like he expected to be swept away again. Walter stared into the fire, letting its warmth seep through his skin like memory. The image of the figure on the cliff had not left him. It was burned behind his eyes like lightning, seen too close. He knew this island better than he knew his own hands. No one else lived here, no one should have been out there, and yet, the stillness in the air carried something different. Not fear, not yet, but knowing. He rose, slowly, quietly, and stepped outside. The rain had turned to mist, rolling in waves across the bluff. The light from the tower moved in wide, slow circles, sweeping over empty trees and slick stone. Walter stood in its path, face lifted toward the cold. It should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. He turned toward the edge of the forest where the figure had stood, and something in his chest stirred. Not panic, not confusion, just a pull, like gravity had shifted sideways. He walked. Brutus followed without sound. The trees whispered as he passed. Not words, not warnings, just sound, old and heavy. The fog thickened, hiding the lighthouse behind him, but Walter didn't turn back. His boots sank slightly into soft earth. A memory returned, uninvited. Clara's voice, quiet in the dark once, saying she sometimes felt like the island was listening, that the cliffs held stories, that the fog could remember things people forgot. He reached the clearing at the edge of the woods, heart steady but slow, breath fogging in the air. There was no one there. No footprints. No broken branches. But the silence was too complete. It was a silence that had weight, and in it, Walter felt something watching, not hostile, not kind, just present. Brutus stopped beside him, tail still, body low. Then he sat, not alert, not guarding, just there, like he understood this wasn't something to fight, just something to witness. Walter didn't speak. He stood in the mist, surrounded by trees and time, and felt, for the first time in years, not alone. The fog lingered, long after the morning came. It moved in slow, gentle sheets across the bluff, softening the edges of the world until nothing felt quite real. Walter stood at the base of the tower, Brutus beside him, the boy a few steps behind, one hand brushing against the dog's back like it grounded him. The others were packing quietly inside the house, preparing to leave as soon as the weather cleared. No one said much. The island had done what it was meant to do. It had held them, given them time, given them a second chance. Walter turned the key in the lighthouse door. The hinges groaned like always. The boy hesitated at the threshold, eyes scanning the spiral staircase, head tilted like he was listening to something Walter couldn't hear. Then he looked up at the keeper, and without speaking, started climbing. Walter followed, one step at a time, Brutus's claws tapping lightly on the iron behind them. At the top, the room was filled with pale light. The Fresnel lens stood silent in the center, its curved glass still glistening with the memory of last night's storm. Walter walked to the console and pressed the switch. The motor hummed to life, quiet but steady, and the great lens began to turn. The beam stretched out across the fog, cutting a path that could not be seen, but was always there. Boy stepped closer to the window. His breath fogged the glass as he stared out, not toward the sea, but back, toward the woods. She said the light was for people who were lost, he said, voice soft, unsure. Not for the ships. Walter didn't answer right away. He placed his hand on the steel railing, feeling the vibration of the turning lens beneath his fingers. He remembered Clara saying those same words in this very room, barefoot and laughing, her hair braided and damp from the rain, her eyes fixed on the horizon like she could see something he couldn't. She was right, he said at last. It's for whoever needs it. The boy nodded slowly, then stepped away from the window, and did something Walter didn't expect. He reached out and took his hand. No fear, no weight, just trust. Walter gripped it gently, surprised by how small it felt and how steady. Brutus sat near the lens, watching both of them, ears relaxed, eyes soft. Outside, the light swept on, even though no ship passed below, even though the radio stayed quiet, even though the keeper no longer had orders. The light remained not because someone told it to, but because someone chose to, and sometimes that was enough.